You know, when I moved into vocational ministry, meaning full-time ministry from the corporate world, that was in the year 2001. One of the first things that we did was to take over the ministries of Dwight Hill, my former discipler, in Southeast Asia. We soon discovered that it was a couples ministry. Even Singapore, which started out essentially as a singles ministry, has over the years become a couples ministry. And that's because we have seen the growth of the church from people who were singles. They got together, and now it's basically a couples church. When we first run this couples retreat there back in 2004, I think, there weren't very many couples, maybe about 10 who attended. And now the number of couples is about 80% are couples now, and only 20% are singles. It was the reverse at that time. So we have quite a bit of experience with couples. Then, one of the things that one of the things that we've seen, and it really is tragic. It's very sad. We see couples over the years that we've been in this ministry. We've seen couples who were very passionately in love. They were smitten by one another. They constantly thought about each other. They used to daydream of each other every day that they were apart. And they tried to please each other every which way they could think of. And the real tragedy is that these very same couples, and we've seen them across different age brackets, different longevities of marriage, couples who barely a few years later can hardly remember those good times. Couples have become this unrecognizable, tragic, comic caricatures of all that they had been just a few short years earlier. We see them all around us, and perhaps you're here this evening and you're thinking, well, why we've become some of those couples ourselves. We're like those couples who barely speak to each other when we're out having a meal together. They say you can very quickly recognize people who are married. They don't talk, they just eat. Couples who snipe, who snarl at each other at the very slightest provocation. We get to see those. Couples who can barely stand one another now, whose words and body language, they betray disdain, even contempt of one another. It's a really tragic thing to watch. And our objective for this next few days is to help us understand why that happens and to see how we might gain from that understanding and maybe help us come back to those idyllic days when we were so in love with one another we could hardly think of anybody else. Now, there are very basic principles that govern that we've discovered over the years, and it just requires very determined application to get you there. The more difficult thing is to stay there. But you can get there. We will get to that. Now, what causes this drift? What drives this drift from one picture to the other? Is there a simple explanation? Is there something that we can do to avoid becoming one of these couples? We come to this conference in a quest for answers to those questions. You see, no one gets married thinking that these days will come, but somehow they do. Sadly, tragically, they are upon us before we even know it. And we seek God's mind to understand why and what we can do about it. We seek His wisdom, His heart, in search of how we can get back to those days. We want to get back there and stay there. This is what Forever Yours, Going the Distance, is all about. You see, one of the things that's true in the world today, and this is increasingly happening, is that a love affair today means a passionate interlude between a couple who are not married. Or at least not married to one another. Books, film, TV, they constantly play this up. It's almost as though they're all conspiring to convince us that this secret adulterous affair is always the more exciting. Well, think about Bridges of Madison County, for instance. You remember that film? It's 1995. It's a film that starred Clint Eastwood and Meryl Streep. It tells the story of Francesca, a lonely housewife in the middle of the United States, rural United States in Iowa. She meets and then falls in love with Clint Eastwood, who's passing through because he's been assigned to do a photographic essay of the covered bridges of Madison County. He's doing that for National Geographic. And for 4 days, while her husband and her children are away in the Illinois State Fair, about 3 hours away, while Francesca, played by Meryl Streep, has a torrid affair with Clint Eastwood. And then the whole thing is romanticized out of her diary, which is only discovered by her children after her death. You know, this brings to mind what an affair is all about. They call it an affair because, you know, people go off to this fair and they have an affair in the fair. That's the etymology of that word. Meryl Streep was nominated for the Best Actress Oscar in that film. And that is just one of the movies, one of the stories that lead one to assume that a passionate and a satisfying love affair between spouses is simply not possible. But you know what? The scriptures very clearly tell us otherwise. If you study the scriptures diligently, you'll soon discover, very quickly discover, that God's explicit will is that spouses love one another, and love one another with an absorbing and satisfying love. That is God's will. A love that embodies both spiritual, emotional, and physical attraction. A love that continues to grow in both the depth and intensity, and that happens throughout their lifetimes together. And yet, think about it. You know, even without a diligent look at the scriptures, that surely is a logical proposition. It is if one accepts the proposition that God made us and that He, God, invented marriage too. And He gave it to the first man and to the first woman as a blessing. Stands to reason that God will simply give us all that we need to have this blessing, all that it can be to each of us. And we shall see that that is in fact the case as we look at the scriptures. Because books, TV, and films have become so pervasive, pulling and shaping our minds so forcefully today, our first task is to go back straight to the architect. We need to go back to the architect of all of this. We'll try and understand what was on his mind when he gave us the first marriage. To do that, we're going to examine the blueprints and the builder's plans that God painstakingly laid down in the scriptures when He put that very first marriage together. We're going to examine what He had in mind when He brought that first husband and wife together. What fundamental principles were foremost in His mind? What instructions did He leave those two? Look, for instance, firstly at Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. In the most foundational of all of the books, Genesis, this is what He says, verse 27, chapter 1. And God, it says, created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them, it says. From the very outset, God made it a point to let us in on fundamental truth. Truth that is so essential to appreciating what He intended marriage to be all about. Firstly, God says the idea of male and female was His own. Male and female, it says, He created them. Genesis, the book of beginnings, declares that as plain fact. God says that in Genesis 1, and only it is from here, only from there, that He reveals His purpose and His method in Genesis 2. Now, this obviously runs opposite the determined campaigns to blur the differences between the sexes today. All this runs squarely against all of the psychobabble around us. All of the noise on left brain, right brain, the overlaps, and getting in touch with your feminine side. It runs against campaigns to intimidate all of us into accepting same-sex marriages. Quickly, however, note God's clear will and intent. Man and woman are essentially different one from the other. They are different. There is no feminine side to a man. There is man and there is woman. God created them to be man and woman. Now, I want you to note in verse 18, Genesis 2, that God designed marriage to meet a fundamental problem of man, the problem of loneliness. It says, and God said, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable, it says. Now, I want to picture man alone. He had only the fellowship of God and of the birds and of the animals. And God knows that only too well, we quickly see. But the very next thing that we see him do is kind of strange. It says in verses 19 to 20, chapter 2, he gives Adam this rather curious job of observing, categorizing, and naming all of the living creatures. It says, God formed every beast of the field, every bird of the sky, and brought them to the man. And the man gave names to all of the cattle, to the birds of the sky, and to every beast of the field. Question is why? Why did he do that? It is immediately after this that God creates the first woman. What does that tell us? God says it was not good for man to be alone, and then proceeds to fashion this perfect solution. He makes another creature, one who was so much like the man, and yet so wondrously unlike him at the same time. Picture the creation of woman. She was taken from him, we were told. Yet, she was designed to complement him. She was totally suitable, spiritually, emotionally, physically. According to God, she was supposed to be designed to be a helper. Now, this puts some women off. But they needn't be off by this. In Psalm 46, this very same Hebrew word for helper is used of God himself. It says he is our helper, a very present help in trouble, it says. Psalm 46, verse 1. Now, note that marriage began with this crying need, a need that has been there from the very beginning, Genesis tells us. Note that it sprung from God's own understanding of that need. God knew man alone is incomplete and needs companionship. That's why he had all of those animals go before Adam to be named. He knew it even though Adam didn't. God had to awaken Adam's awareness of that need by having him go through that ritual. Do you know that to the degree that you do not meet each other's spiritual, emotional, and physical needs today, that to the same degree the two of you are still alone? You are. This is what that says. It is our hope that through this conference you will come back to God's plan for you from the very beginning. Physical, spiritual, and emotional intimacy forever. How did Adam react to all of this? Immediately following verse 23 tells us, in no uncertain terms. And the man said, "This is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man," he says. Now, Hebrew scholars tell us English simply doesn't do justice to this. In Hebrew, this has Adam literally jumping for joy. It records his tremendous excitement. He's shouting. He's saying, "At last, I have found the one who completes me." the one who takes my loneliness away, the one who will be as dear to me as my flesh. She's beautiful, it says, perfectly suited. She is all I will ever need. That's what's said in the Hebrew. It doesn't say that in English, does it? A commentator, he traced the origin of the Hebrew word for woman. The word is isha. It comes from a root word meaning to be soft. It's an expression of the delightful and novel femininity of a woman. Try and imagine their emotions during that first time together. Imagine when man and woman first met and realized what they were meant to be to each other. All tired jokes to the contrary, marriage was designed by God Himself to bring joy, to bring happiness to the first man and woman. And His purposes have not changed one bit. Clearly, marriage was designed by God to bring joy and happiness to spouses. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise today. Now, let's go to the marriage blueprint itself. That would be in Genesis 2 in verses 24 to 25. It's a three-part command. These are mostly one-syllable words in English. This 22 plain and English and easily understood words, they sum up, did you know, the entire teaching of marriage in Scripture. All else that is said in other places are simply comments. They emphasize, they amplify the three fundamental principles that are originated here. They don't change them in the slightest. Firstly, it says, man shall leave his father and his mother. Marriage, it says, begins with a leaving of all other relationships in order to establish a permanent relationship between one man and one woman. All lesser relationships are to be broken, clearly, decidedly left behind, we are told. Even though bonds with parents are lasting and permanent, even those ties must indelibly be changed to reflect a full and unreserved commitment to one's spouse. There are many applications of this, if you really think about it. Spouses are to establish their own households. Husband is to assume headship over that household. He's no longer subject to the authority of his parents. Spouses are to refocus their lives on each other, we are told. They are to depend on one another to meet their respective needs, allowing for each other's differences and failings, never, ever allowing others to dictate how they are to live their lives. That's hard on parents, by the way. You know, when my son and my daughter-in-law came to live with us for a vacation for 2 months, we had to restrain ourselves because every time we would notice something that we would like to have seen different. It's very difficult to do that for parents. It's also very difficult for the son and the daughter to not be under the thumb of the parents. But the Bible tells us very clearly, you are to leave the home of your parents, and to cleave to your wife. This means giving everything else a lesser priority. Business, career, hobbies, talents, interests, even ministry are all to be lesser priorities. Sadly, over the years that we've been in this ministry, we've found that there are couples who deliberately try to live the single life as married people. You know, they try not to change their schedules. They try not to change the times that they spend with friends. You know, that is very far from what God intended. You are supposed to make the center, your relationship, the center of everything else from that point on. As though to underscore this, we find this decree in Deuteronomy 24, in verse 5. It says, when a man takes a new wife, he shall not go out with the army, nor charged with any duty. He shall be free at home 1 year, it says. And he shall give happiness to his wife whom he has taken. Don't know about you, but I find this fascinating. Shows how well ancient Israelites understood marriage. They understood how fundamental to everything marriage was. To get a new household established was a higher priority than even the all-important affairs of state, like going off and fighting a war. Food for thought for our so-called modern, enlightened societies today, don't you think? Now, second principle. Man shall cleave to his wife. For this cause, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife. And they shall become one flesh, we are told. Now, this second principle says, there is no use leaving unless you are prepared to spend a lifetime cleaving to each other. Now that this principle is directed, this is directed, like the very first principle was directed to the husband. Even though the principle applies to both partners. And what does that imply? Husbands, what do you think that implies? And I'm sure the husbands are thinking, I'm sure, I don't know. Well, let's see if we can help you. What does it mean to cleave? The English word, it causes confusion because it has two opposing meanings. The more common one, the more common meaning is to divide, to split, to open. That's why butchers use a cleaver to cut meat into pieces. But splitting and dividing is precisely the opposite of what we mean here. The meaning intended is the second meaning in English, to adhere, to stick, to be attached. I think this is best illustrated by two blocks of wood that have been deliberately glued together. Each block contains its unique characteristics, but they have been fused into one, and for all intents and purposes, they have become one. And that's exactly what the rest of the passage goes on to say. And they shall become one flesh, it says. The word clearly says that we are to actively, to decisively adhere, to cling to our spouses. Now, there is nothing passive about cleaving. And to catch the intended force of meaning, consider how the word in Hebrew, the word dabak, is used. In Deuteronomy alone, it is used for cleaving to the living God. Deuteronomy 10, verse 20, you shall fear the Lord your God, you shall serve him, and cling to him. That's the word dabak. Deuteronomy 11, verse 22, if you are careful to keep all this commandment, which I am commanding you to do it, to love your Lord, your God, to walk in all his ways, and to hold fast to him. Deuteronomy 13, verse 4, cling to him. And 30, verse 20, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice, by holding fast to him. That is the intended word. That is dabak. That is the word to cleave. Now, this all indicate that in the eyes of God, cleaving means a wholehearted commitment. It is purely spiritual at the start, but cleaving naturally spills over into every other area of our lives. Cleaving, it soon progresses into the intellectual, the emotional, and the physical. Cleaving to your partner in Genesis 2, verse 24, means to do so in the smallest details of our lives. My friends, anything that puts distance between you intellectually, emotionally, physically is to be avoided because it breaks that divine pattern. And that's why it's very clear that you make a break from your single life when you enter the married life. You cannot live as a single in a married relationship. Cleaving encompasses two characteristics. Firstly, an unswerving loyalty, And secondly, an active pursuing love that simply will not let go. Now, we'll get into both of those areas again and again in the messages and workshops tomorrow. Finally, the third principle. Husband and wife are one flesh. Verses 24 and 25, for this cause a man shall leave his father, his mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And some very clear implications from the very outset. Marriage was designed to be monogamous, and secondly, marriage was designed to be heterosexual. This final command, more importantly, rules out all adultery and promiscuity on the part of the partners. It cannot get any clearer. The two shall become one, it says. You know, the Bible actually previews the misery and the long-term effects of polygamous marriage and adultery. Proverbs 6 verse 32, it says, he who commits adultery with a woman is lacking sense. He who would destroy himself does it. From the very start, God's intent was one man to one woman. He always intended monogamy to be the norm. Now, although it goes far deeper than the physical, becoming one flesh clearly starts with an intimate physical union. It starts with sexual intercourse. Indeed, the biblical expression for sexual intercourse is to know. Genesis 4, verse 1, Adam knew Eve. Matthew chapter 1, 24 to 25, Joseph knew Mary not until she had brought forth her firstborn. Didn't have sex with her until she had brought forth her firstborn, Jesus. Now remember this. It was always meant to be one man and one woman. Never forget that. You also need that again and again as the gathering propaganda for same-sex marriages get louder and louder. And then there's this other thing that jumps out from this text. God always meant marriage to be heterosexual. In fact, scan the scriptures from cover to cover, and you can't escape it. This has always been God's clear intent. From the very start, God meant marriage to be heterosexual between one man and one woman. God declares how He looks at homosexual sex very clearly and plainly. Leviticus 18 verse 22 says, you shall not lie with the male as one lies with the female. It is an abomination, it says. An abomination. You cannot get a stronger word. Leviticus 20 verse 13, there's a man who lies with a male as those who lie with a woman. Both of them have committed a what? A detestable act, we are told. And they shall surely be put to death. But one final observation from all of this. The word new is used in both the Old and the New Testament for sexual intercourse. But it is also used, that word new is also used to speak of loving personal knowledge of Abraham. Genesis 18, verse 19. For I know him, same word, that he will command his children and his household after him. They shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment. The divine pattern for marriage is therefore not only intimate physically, He also meant it to have husband and wife, to have tender, intimate, personal knowledge of each other. God always meant husband and wife to be one, as in weaving to one another, as in a broad and beautiful tapestry. So, husband and wife are to leave father and mother, to cleave to one another, and finally to weave into one another. See, the metaphor of weaving to one another is a very obvious one, and it is no doubt on God's heart when He inspired Moses to write that man and wife were both naked and yet unashamed. Immediately calls to mind that spouses are to be intimate with one another in multiple ways. They're to be intimate physically, spiritually, emotionally, and every which way one can be intimate. I doubt that those who make wedding rings realize this, but that's the same metaphor that they're fashioning, they're creating, putting into those intricate designs that they engrave on rings. They're weaving. Why are marriages in trouble today, every which way you turn? Some really troubling statistics. These come from the research of the late Dr. David Larson, who specialized in correlations between the behavioral practices and health. In 1960, he says there were 25 divorces for every 100 marriages. And then in 1975, divorce numbers jumped to 48 divorces per 100 marriages. Today, some 40-odd years later, the statistics stand at 60 for every 100 marriages. And this is only in places where they are reported. I suspect that number is higher now. If you're doing the math in your head, that's a whopping 150% increase in just one generation. Shocking statistics. And they won't be getting any better either. Do you know that in the United States today, 70% of black babies, they're born out of wedlock? 70%. Only 34% in the U.S. of children will live with both biological parents through the age of 18. 62% of mothers with children under 3 are employed. So what does that combine into? It's a recipe for trouble. The business of mothers combined with the non-involvement of fathers means that all too often there is simply nobody home with the kids. And no wonder children are in such a mess in the United States today. James Dobson, multi-awarded author of so many bestsellers, 30 of them, probably the single most influential authority on parenting today. This is what he says. Why is America in trouble today? He writes, clearly something has gone terribly wrong. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence of the crisis is the increase in violence, especially those terrifying school killings, shootings. Chronic neglect of boys during the first 2 years of life, says, is devastating, psychologically and neurologically. With children, when children are ignored, he writes, when they're mistreated, when they're shuffled from one caregiver to another, terrible losses occur in their thinking capacity. The more serious the abuse, the greater the damage. In fact, confirmed by medical and behavioral research. Research focusing on infants, for instance, and on teens who were horribly abused as babies. They were beaten. For examples were children who were beaten and scalded by mentally ill or cocaine-addicted parents. Extreme neglect or rejection of that nature causes a child's body to produce significant quantities of hormones that move through the bloodstream to targeted areas of the brain that are there for compassion and conscience. The damage, you see, never repairs itself. And ultimately, it hits the individual's ability to feel for others late in life. This is why so many of those teenage criminals in those school shootings appear to have no conscience, no remorse whatsoever. Those kids were literally brain damaged. Where does that whole debacle, where does that all spring from? Well, from the fundamental problem of troubled marriages. Why are marriages in trouble? The answer is obvious. Because somehow, some way, we continue to violate the architect's blueprints. One would think that the presenting problems are simple enough to analyze and to understand. After all, the blueprints are quite straightforward. But failed marriages, even among the spiritual stars, tell us it isn't all that simple. Failed marriages among those whose lifelong vocations have been to study and to teach the Word of God gives us pause. Take the failed marriages of Charles Ryrie. You're familiar with the Ryrie Bible? Take that man. Or Charles Stanley. And many, many others, I'm sure. There are all tragedies that should give us pause. They tell us we need to look more closely. There's something here that we're all missing, even the very best of us. Now, to make sense of all of this, this is how we came to the ministry of Dr. Emerson Eggerichs. Dr. Eggerichs was interviewed on U.S. Prime Television when his book, Love and Respect, had sold almost 500,000 copies. At the time, too, their marriage, as announced by Paul, that marriage conference of theirs had become the gold standard, and they were touring the whole United States from coast to coast with that conference. He just come out, too, at that time of this TV interview. He had come out with a bestseller called Cracking the Communication Code. I want us to listen to the full TV interview. It's not very long. The video isn't too good, but the audio is pretty clear. But I want them to run that now. Can we?
Do you practice what you preach? Your
Right.
marriage went through its own evolution.
Yes,
with this,
yes.
didn't it?
Oh, yeah. We all, and one of the things that we say is that we practice what we preach because we get on that crazy cycle. And one of the things we're encouraging, we're all going to get on that crazy cycle because we're pink and blue. We're male and female. The key is rebounding. Another answer here is that we're not going to do this perfectly. Right. And Sarah and I have taken that pressure off ourselves. We're going to get into our spats and our differences, but we rebound. At a certain point, I make that decision. Is Sarah a good-willed woman, even though her eyes darken, her face sours, the motherly finger comes out, she rolls her eyes? All of those are gestures of contempt in our world. But that's not what Sarah's trying to do. She's actually saying, only you can meet a need I have. You're the only one that can meet a need for love that I have. You're the adult in my life that I need this from. Can't you figure that out?
Right. Right.
Now, let me go to bat for your gender here, because
Yes,
he
please
always
do.
talks about how Sarah is the one that comes. You make it sound like you've never done anything wrong.
No, heavens. I mean,
I love this.
if I came across, let me make a humble confession. No. That's the point, coming back to Sarah and saying, I am sorry. That's what we were referencing, because I've done that so many times. I am sorry, will you forgive me? And I've learned that instead of running from her, which is my natural propensity, because I don't like that feeling, it's just very uncomfortable. But when I take the hit, turn to her on the heels of having failed her again and again and again, Sarah just softens. I learned there's power in this. And that's the thing we're trying to say to the man. It will never be easy, and here's the point. God commands us to love our wives. Why? Because it's not within my nature to do it as naturally as it is in her. Agape love is only the command to us. You're not commanded to agape love.
No, that's true.
Because you do that by nature, but you don't respect by nature.
No. Well, it's hard.
Here's the point. When you feel unloved, it's not natural for you to be respectful.
Right.
And when I feel disrespected, it's not natural for me to be loving. And thus the command. Husbands, love your wives. Why? It protects me when I feel disrespected to reacting to Sarah in unloving ways. Now, will I do it perfectly? No. But like basketball, the whole game of rebounding, offensively, defensive, is based on this assumption. You never score 100% of the time coming down the court.
Right.
So, too, in marriage, we're not going to love perfectly. The Lord knows we're not. That's why we need a Savior, by the way. But we're not going to respect perfectly. But we can rebound. After I do it wrong, I'm off by myself, sulking, feeling sorry for myself, the Lord speaks. Okay, do you have enough guts to go back? Get up out of your chair and go back and seek Sarah's forgiveness. Well, Lord, it's past. I don't want to do that. Emerson, go back and seek her forgiveness. But Lord, Emerson.
Yeah. One of the biggest things we get on our prayer line here is one of the issues, our relationships, our marriages, and we see that there's a pattern of them suffering to such a great extent. I hear what you're saying, and I think one of the biggest fears, particularly for women, I think, is that, okay, I hear you, and I believe you.
Yes.
But I'm afraid that if I do it, that he won't do his part.
Well, yes, exactly. We're all afraid. The same thing with loving. But here's what Peter says in 1 Peter 3, 1 and 2. Husbands who are disobedient to the word could be won through respectful behavior. The wives were asking, how do I win my disobedient husband? He's disobedient. He doesn't deserve respect. He hasn't earned respect, but respectful behavior. So too Paul says respect. So here are two no small apostles, Paul and Peter, revealing that respect toward the spirit of the male must be the secret that cracks the communication code. Just as Hosea 3:1, go love a woman who's an adulteress. He won his wife through love. You win a man through respect. But ultimately, we do this not because the husband deserves it, but because Jesus Christ commands it. And the question really ultimately is, will I trust that as I do this, I'm doing it unto Christ beyond the shoulder of my spouse? That's really the motivation. One of the things we do in the conference as well as the book, talk about, okay, this man doesn't deserve it. It's not a matter. But disrespectful communication won't get through to him. So the question, can you communicate it respectfully? when he doesn't deserve it, but then looking beyond the shoulder of your husband, that Jesus Christ is standing there saying, you can do this. You can do this out of love and reverence for me, out of trust and obedience toward me. Trust me now as you do this over a period of time that I will honor your trust and your obedience. And that ultimately is so true with the husbands. At the end of our conference, we call men and women to come forward, men on the left, women on the right, to do this unto Jesus Christ, because at the end of the day, your spouse is irrelevant in that sense. The command is given to me to love Sarah, whether she's lovable or not. Can I say to Christ, well, Lord, you know, Sarah wasn't lovable, therefore I didn't have to obey your command. There's an exception in my case, right? Mm-hmm. Wives don't have to respect their husbands because obviously he's not respectable. So the command can just be cut out of the Scripture. But not many women who love Christ would conclude that. So it is a faith venture, and trust Abba that he knows what he's talking about, and when he reveals this truth, it is a secret that will crack the communication code. And again, I know that every husband over a period of time will soften if he uses vocabulary, and that's why we talk about this in cracking the communication code.
We've talked about this as a one-to-one venture, but most families are comprised of children as well, and,
yes,
and they come into the equation, and lots of times there might not be love or respect shown by them or by parents to their children. How do you factor them into the equation?
Well, that's my next book, and it's a very important thing, and I've discovered things in Scripture that apply to that very point. But we all need love and respect, and what happens in the case of a man, he knows that he needs respect, so that young child who shows him disrespect, that's why he shuts down. But the wife doesn't always understand what that man is feeling, and we are developing material that will help that husband understand why his child is doing what he or she is doing. Usually it's crying out for love, but if you personalize that and think, well, that child is being disrespectful, and you overreact, you're on that family crazy cycle. Without love, a child reacts without respect, and without respect, a parent reacts without love, and that spins out of control in the family, and we help families decode that as well.
Okay, well, Doctor, thank you so much for being with us. You have got to come back and when you get your other book out,
yes,
because
yes,
it really is, you see, if you have a son or a daughter, and you see that whole cycle actually repeats in the next generation, and so you really want to know how to get it with your husband and then with your kids as well. So you've got to come back. We thank you so much for coming and being with us. Again, it's Cracking the Communication Code. You can go onto our website, find out how you can purchase the book. And Doctor, what is your website?
loveandrespect.com. LOVEANDRESPECT.
I like that. It sounds like a song.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Well, we will be right back with Nancy Lee DeMoss. But first, here's some information about shortwave radio. Thank you.
Okay,
thank you so much.
You know, this ministry of Dr. Eggerichs got started when he combined his notes with someone by the name of Dr. Gottman, Dr. John Gottman. He was a nerdy West Coast University psychologist, and he gained renown through a research methodology called thin slicing. Thin slicing. The research proves what is at the very core of a very healthy relationship. It uses careful observation and analysis to find patterns of unconscious and subconscious behavior in very narrow slices of experience. There's almost nothing instinctive about the approach. It's almost pure science. And, you know, they're never given to snap judgments, those practitioners. The research is terribly impressive. Covered 3,000 couples over 20-some years. And after analyzing 3,000 hours of husband and wife dialogues, Dr. Gottman was able to prove that he can predict with 95% accuracy whether a couple will still be married 15 years after that interview. Do you believe that? 15 years later, he can predict 95% accuracy. You know how he does that? By focusing on what he calls the 4 horsemen. 4 verbal clues that indicate defensiveness, stonewalling, criticism, and, get this, contempt. You know, of the 4, that one emotion, contempt, is the most important of all. And if his team observes one or both partners in a marriage showing contempt toward the other, he pounces on that because he knows that they won't be married very much longer. Which tells you respect is very important. And we're going to get into that. Women don't like it much when we get too strongly into that, so we have to balance it off. We're going to talk about love too, I promise you, ladies. But tomorrow, you want to be here bright and early. By the way, we're we're taking statistics of who comes early and who doesn't, because we want to prove that this format, doing it in a church like this, works. Okay? So come bright and early. You don't want to miss the very first session. We'll see you tomorrow night.